All right, and everyone can see my screen and you see VS Code in the Rick and Morty site. Beautiful. All right, we're going to do a little bit of review of Cypress front-end tests for the Rick and Morty app that we built earlier for our general React review. So we're going to cover a couple things in the testing review. I'm going to go ahead and install Cypress, right? And running tests, and we're going to write tests. And we're going to write tests for a number of things. We're going to write tests. We're going to make sure the header exists. We're going to make sure the nav bar has the correct structure and links. We're going to make sure routing works, that nav bar links work. We're going to make sure the home page has stuff. We're going to make sure the about page has stuff. We're going to make sure character cards get rendered on the all characters page. And I'm going to make sure that individual character detail page renders with correct stuff. If we have time, we will also make sure favorites page has favorites. I think we'll be able to get through at least half of these. I am going to do, I think, just a bit more talking and driving, just in the interest of time. That said, please do ask questions as we go. That's very much the purpose of this review, so please do fire away. And if it's something I need to shift or maybe tackle at the end of it, I'll just let you know. Does that sound good to everyone? Okay, awesome. Let's do it. So I gotta install Cypress, first of all. So I do npm install Cypress. I'm going to want to do save-dev because this is a dev dependency. And we'll give Cypress a minute. And you don't have to do this for the assessment because it's already set up. So once you run npm install, this will happen. And this is actually taking longer than I would expect. So let's just give this a sec and see what's going on. Interesting. That was a surprise. Let's just try it again. There we go. I don't know what the heck that is. Let's see if Cypress works. And I think I will just add to my package.json the script open. So let's go here to scripts. And this script should already be created for you in the assessment. And I believe we just need to run npx Cypress open. And let me confirm that I actually have this right. Actually, we don't even need the npx when we're running this as an npm script. It can just be Cypress open. And again, this script should already be created for you in the assessment. You won't have to write it yourself. I should now be able to run npm run sci open, and it should open up Cypress for me. I did not expect this to happen. I'm honestly not immediately sure of the root cause, especially since, like just a couple days ago, I installed and ran Cypress just fine. So probably related to that weirdness that happened before. Let's not worry about this sudo stuff. Let's try Cypress cache clear and some reinstalling. So this, I don't think this will be an issue for all of you. It is less than likely. And in fact, I don't think, and in fact, what I'm going to do, and this is a good trick, sometimes if stuff gets messed up, just delete the node modules directory because I have all the dependencies in package.json. And in fact, I'm going to delete package lock.json because I have all the dependencies in package.json. And npm install will create a new package lock.json with the specific versions of all these dependencies and their dependencies, and create the node modules directory and install everything in it. So let's see if this works, because Cypress is now here added as a dev dependency from when I installed it before, though that install seems to have an issue. So let's see if this works or if this hangs. So that's a good sign. I'm a little surprised it took that long. Let's try Cypress now. Okay, there we go. Cypress now seems to be working. Indeed, I actually have the GUI on my other window, so let me just pull it up and bring it over here so we can see it. So honestly, not sure what that issue was. I think the takeaway is if something gets wonky, it's always safe to delete node modules and delete package lock.json if you have all your dependencies in package.json. So we're going to set up end-to-end testing. You, again, do not have to do any of this for the assessment. All of this is already set up. If you are running WSL2, you may need to use Chromium or Electron instead of Chrome, or if you are running Linux. If you're on a Mac, Chrome should work okay. All of these will accomplish the same thing. So this is good, right? Cypress is up and running. We haven't written any tests yet, so there wouldn't be anything here, but we've got what we need. So let's just do a very quick review of Cypress to see what there is. So we've installed Cypress. It's been added as a dev dependency, which we see right here. I've added a package.json script so I can run Cypress open with npm run sciopen. I'm also going to add a script, which again, you will have and don't need to write for the assessment, scirun, if I want to run an individual Cypress test on the command line. And that one will look like this. So I would use that command to run an individual Cypress test, and it would look something like, and let me open up a new terminal here and navigate into Rick and Morty. npm run sci run, and then I would give it the path to like the test file I want to run, which we don't have yet, but we're going to create. So Cypress created a Cypress config.js file for me. You do not need to create this for the assessment. You should not need to modify it unless you have something non-standard going on where your Beat dev server is not running on port 51, 70, 73 or 74, its default port. You will not have to create the Cypress directory that has fixtures and support. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a directory for end-to-end tests that will name E2E, name E2E for end-to-end, and the end-to-end tests that we write are going to go in there. So now that we've done a bit of setup and we have Cypress working, let's actually write a couple tests. And so the one thing that is important to note about Cypress is, and I think I'm just going to rename this terminal right here to Cypress so I can remember what it is. And I'm going to rename this one right here to dev server. To remember what it is, I need to have my npm dev server running for Cypress tests, because Cypress actually drives the browser to navigate to this site. So if I don't have the app, the dev server with the app running, Cypress won't have an app to talk to do tests to drive the browser for. And I'll make a third terminal here so that I can, if I need to do stuff on the command line, I can do it here without having to kill these two. And this is a pretty good setup for the assessment because most of what you'll be doing, you will not have to kill or restart either the dev server or Cypress, for they both have hot module reloading. So if you have one terminal for the dev server, one terminal for Cypress, and then one terminal for the command line for anything you might need to do on the command line, that should be a pretty stable setup for you. Mickey, yes, sir.
Yeah, this one should be a really quick question. Since you don't actually have to be online to run the localhost and be able to look at your page within a browser, do you also not have to be online to run Cypress and get it to all work?
You do not have to be online to run Cypress, but as soon as your React app tries to make an HTTP request to the Rick and Morty API or the Pokemon API, that's
Okay.
happening over the internet, and that'll fail if you don't have an internet connection. And any Cypress test that is doing something that makes the app do that will also, that test will then fail. But
Yeah,
Cypress
great
itself
point.
is fine. But yeah, great question. So for working on the assessment, in essence, you do need to be online. You're not going to be able to get very far on a practical level. So the way that the Cypress test works is we give Cypress CSS classes or HTML elements, and Cypress looks in the DOM for the browser for those HTML elements and, checks if they exist, checks what their contents is. So I'll write some Cypress tests as we go, but that's going to be the general approach. And it'll be really useful to have this open so I can kind of see what's what and what I need as I do this. And again, you all will not have to do this for the assessment as the tests are written. But it's good to have it. And the Cypress docs are incredible and are your friend. And it's the API here in the docs that have the stuff that we care about. And this, I think, could be quite helpful for you in terms of reading Cypress tests. So I'll just have this up here for me as we go. And I'm just going to go ahead and create a test file to check that the header exists. And we'll just name it one. Let's try that one more time. One checking header. And the file extension does need to be .cy.jsx so that Cypress will find it. But again, all these tests are already written for you. And so in Cypress, and I'll close this out because, and we can see also the directory structure up here. And by the way, you can also navigate around here between like directories and stuff, which can be quite useful. So each test starts with what's called a describe block. That's basically a container where we just have in text a description of what the test does. And then an arrow function that holds the actual contents of the test itself. And the it block is an individual test, and we might have multiple it blocks inside one single describe block. So let's check brand to be Rick and Morty. And let me check what my actual brand is here. And indeed it is Rick and Morty. So that seems like a good starting point. And the it block, just like the describe block, takes an arrow function as its second argument. And so now we need to tell Cypress with CY to navigate to actually drive the browser to the root page of our website. And I actually need to do a little bit of setup in the Cypress config here. I forgot that because you all don't need to do this for the assessment, doesn't mean that I don't need to do this for my code because I'm not working off of the assessment code. So I'm going to add this in now. You all will have this in your Cypress config, but this is a good review. We have a JavaScript object here that's our config object. And we have this E2E end-to-end property inside that config object. That's also an object. And that's where we're going to put all this stuff that we care about. The base URL. So this is where Cypress always starts from, which is going to be HTTP, localhost port 5173, like I was saying, and this is for the URL of our Beat dev server. And I'm going to tell Cypress we're not using support files that can do certain extra behaviors that we don't care about. I'm going to tell Cypress that I don't want it to record a video for me because that's just going to take extra time and eat up hard drive space, and I don't need the video. And I'm going to set something reasonable for the default viewport width when Cypress opens the browser, and the default viewport height when Cypress opens the browser. So let me actually get these right. 1024 for the width and 768 for the height. And this I will just leave as its default boilerplate code, and we don't need to touch it. And I think I actually will kill and restart Cypress now just because I've modified the config. But Cypress does do hot module reloading, so I shouldn't need to do, even as you're writing your code, you should be able to kind of run the tests. And note that this checking header test now is there, but nothing has really run yet. And that's because we haven't really put anything in the test yet. So let's go ahead now that we've set up our config object, let's hop back to this test and add what we need to add. So now that we've set that base URL, visiting the root of that base URL makes a lot more sense. Cypress is going to our homepage. And I want Cypress to get an HTML element on that page, a nav element, and confirm that it exists. And now let's actually see if we can't run this Cypress test. And now, in fact, it does work. And let me make this full screen so we can see this in action. So now that this test does something, and in fact, once the test runs, when I mouse over this, I can see each of these actions. Right? So we visit localhost 5173. Clicking here, we haven't actually gone there and the page hasn't loaded yet. At this point, the browser has indeed loaded. And as a friendly reminder, in Cypress, this is a full-on browser. So I can do inspect, and I can have the inspector here. So this is useful when debugging while you're working on the assessment, and the JavaScript console if I need to. So that is potentially a very useful way to get additional information if you have a test failing to see what's going on. In fact, I don't have React DevTools in here, but I have the elements in the consoles, and that will get you pretty far. And this test passes because indeed a nav exists. Let's add a bit more to the code. Let's assert that. And here what I'm doing, and let me hop back over to the other browser so we can see it in action. So I now want to confirm that inside that nav element, right here, if you look in the lower right, is this A tag, this href. And remember that this is created by the Bootstrap navbar. So if I go to header.jsx, note that in my header component, I don't see an href, I see the Bootstrap navbar brand component. But when this component renders, what it renders is this A tag that's href, right? So as you're working on the assessment, it is important to not only look at the React code, but use the DevTools in the browser and the Elements tab to look at the actual HTML that gets rendered, because that's what Cypress actually interacts with, is the HTML and the DOM. It does not interact with React and React components. React components render stuff to the DOM, and then that's what Cypress interacts with. Daniel, yes, sir.
I was wondering if we have to use Bootstrap and Tailwind for the assessment, or we can use any CSS framework?
If it says you have to use it, you have to use it. If it doesn't say, it's up to you, and you can do whatever you want. Which I realize is a bit of a non-answer, but also the spec is pretty darn specific. So as you read through it, you'll be able to tell.
Copy. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Joseph, yes, sir.
Just throwing it out there, I did try to use Bootstrap for implementing my nav bar, and I was getting an error with the saying that the text wasn't there. So I just went back to like the regular nav bar using CSS, and that one worked. So I just strapped trying to use Bootstrap.
I think that makes sense. And I think unless you're being specifically told to use Bootstrap, it just adds an extra layer that is probably not worth it in terms of getting the tests on the assessment to pass. And actually, you raise a really good point. Let me code up this test and we can discuss it. And I'll come back to that point that you raised. So Cypress tests get pretty darn specific, as really any kind of end-to-end test does, whether it's on the front end or the back end. Because I want to make sure everything exists in the test. And this test I'm writing to the HTML generated by Bootstrap. And the only way for me to know what goes in this test is by looking at this right here. And again, you all do not need to write these tests, but it is, I think, valuable to see this process. So we can see that Bootstrap renders a nav element. And then I'm telling Cypress, hey, inside the nav, you should grab the first child div, and it should have a CSS class named container on it, which again, Bootstrap does for us. And then, in fact, to add onto that, and we're doing this step by step so that if one of these things is missing, we get a useful error. Let's tell Cypress, hey, inside that div that's inside that nav, there should be an A tag. And it should exist, right? First, let's make sure that it exists. And it should also have a class. And that class should be navbar brand. And again, the only way for me to know this is to look at the actual HTML being rendered by the Bootstrap component. And now that we've checked that all these things exist, I can safely test and say, hey, Cypress, find the element with the CSS class navbar brand, which we now know exists. And it should have text inside of it that says Rick and Morty. Right? And so to go back to the point that you guys raised and that you mentioned about, hey, I used Bootstrap and it caused the pain and I got rid of it and life was easier, it's important to read the test in the assessment because the assessment test will tell you very specifically what CSS classes need to exist on what div elements. And so you need to write your code to match that specification of the test. Now, if the HTML and CSS that Bootstrap generates doesn't match that specification, yes, you can do stuff to figure out how to make it all match up, but that's a lot of extra work. And if Bootstrap isn't required, that is extra work being done for really no reason that's relevant in terms of like the required functionality and specification for this assessment. So if it's not required, not using it is only going to make your life easier, especially because of the nature of these Cypress tests. So I just want to check in with folks and see if that makes sense and if anyone has questions sort of around that.
That helps. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, very good questions. And let's run these tests. And in fact, let me go ahead and let me just make one tiny change here and add an extra space. And let's watch that part of the test fail because of that tiny change in the string, just like we saw with our object-oriented end-to-end tests from the last assessment. String comparisons are exact. And so here, I see here, hey, we run this test. We visit the site. We assert the nav bar exists. We grab that div and we assert that it exists. So far, so good. And this is why it's nice having a test that goes step by step like this, because we can see, hey, all these things work, but then this fails. And string comparisons can be tricky to track down. And in fact, the fact that here we see the string rendered with the special character NBSP, which I think stands for non-breaking space, which is basically an empty space, is actually useful because it makes it stand out. So this is saying, hey, we expected the text to be Rick and Morty with the space, but actually it was just plain Rick and Morty. Now, I deliberately wrote that test so it would fail, and that's a very useful technique sometimes. So let's change the test to actually be correct. And now that we see it, it passes. Any questions before we go ahead and make another test? All right, let's do it. So if I hop back to the README, we knocked out this test. I may have been a little over ambitious. We probably can't get through all of these, but making sure that the navbar links work, I think, is the big one. So let's keep on rolling. So I think I want to make a test now, just named like nav structure. And it's going to be similar to the one we just wrote, so I can move through it a little quicker, I think. What we're going to do in here, we're going to have our describe block, and it's going to be, again, header JSX, I'm just going to say, our arrow function, and let's have a couple input blocks. And this is going to, I'm so sorry, I'm getting a terribly wrong autocomplete. Let's check that all nav bar links exist and have correct routes. Let's see what this test looks like. So as always, we need to navigate to our homepage. Once we're on the homepage, we're going to need to get the navbar, and we're going to, in fact, need to get the links inside here. And if I open up this div here where they're kind of collapsed, if I look in here, I see with Bootstrap, the class is navlink. So let's use that CSS class to grab what we want. And let's do sci.get the navlink class. Sci.get will get all of the HTML elements that have this class. So it actually returns an array because there's more than one. So let's get the first one. And that's what EQ will do for us. Let's grab the 0th index thing at the array. And let's say that it should contain text. And I believe about is my first link if I look here. Yep, so I think it should contain the text about. And it also should have an attribute on the element, and it should have an href attribute. And that href attribute should have the value about. And let's run this test and see if it works. So now we're cooking, and I can pretty much just copy this format and change it for, after about is all characters. So let's do all characters. And that path was characters. And that's not the 0th thing in the array, but the first thing in the array. And then let's do the same for the favorites page. And if I hop over to Cypress, it's still running the test. And it looks like I did something wrong here. So let's see what I did wrong. Timed out, we expected nav link to contain text favorites, but it was all characters. So I wonder if maybe this test just needs to run again.
I think it's the
And if-
index.
Say that again.
I think it's the index and the third one. I think you're supposed to have index 2 in the EQ.
Oh, you're so right. Thank you. I didn't change the index to grab the third thing in the array. Thank you. Yeah, and if you do need to run the tests again for some reason, there's run all tests up here. We'll do that. And I think this is really all we need for this test. We can kind of see how we can use Cypress to do this. What'll be really useful to see is let's use Cypress now to actually click on some of these links and navigate. And let's see what that test looks like. So let me pull up the browser. Let me pull up my code. And I'm just going to go ahead here and make a new file here. And we're going to call it test3 route functions.cy.jsx. I'm going to close this out because I don't really need this anymore. I'm going to copy this stuff because there's enough useful code here that I don't want to repeat. But we're not checking that like the links exist. Let's check that the links route to correct paths when the user clicks on them. Right? And Cypress is literally driving around the mouse on the browser. So Cypress is indeed simulating the user. And a lot of this code will be similar. We still need to visit the homepage. We still need to find the first link, which is going to be the about page link. But we don't need to check the text because we've already done that. We just need to click on it. And same for, and forgive me for that massive formatting jump, just my indentation wasn't matching up and it was driving me a little nuts. The all characters page link is going to be right here. And for this one again, we're just going to click on it. And in fact, let's just maybe do this method chaining on one line. The style doesn't matter. JavaScript, unlike Python, doesn't care about indentation or white spacing. So it's really kind of personal preference or whatever the team's preference is in terms of writing style. And then this is our favorites page. And we're going to click on this one as well. I'm going to do a little formatting. So we're clicking on this stuff, but I haven't written any tests yet. But we can hop over to Cypress and we can watch the clicks happen just for fun. And over here where it says new URL, it indicates that we've gone somewhere new. And in fact, if there we see the change. Note that I need to kind of move down to the thing. Click is over here, but it's actually the next part of the test where I see the updated browser state. So that's potentially confusing. So just FYI. And then same over here. Here we're on the all characters page. And here we're on the favorites page. We haven't really told Cypress to wait for stuff to load. And so that may be part of why we see the loading page here, because we're navigating from page to page. You know, it took like, I think almost a second to get all the characters to load. So let's add a bit more to this test and see what it looks like. So first of all, let's add some assertions. Let's check the actual location of the browser. And we call this location function on the Sci object. And we assert that it should be, and the way that this should statement needs to work with location is we need to pass an arrow function And I believe this is because once we've navigated to the browser, I think this is just how we need to tell Cypress, like, to get the browser's location. I'm honestly not 100% sure why this needs to work this way, but it sort of makes sense because we are now checking something where we have to wait for the browser to do it. So Cypress maybe needs to manage the timing. But inside here, we can have an assertion and we can use the expect function for a statement. And we can do location dot path name to equal about. And because I just wrote a lot of code there, let me hop over to Cypress and make sure that this is working. We hit a timeout. I made a very easy mistake here, which is note that I put just the one about without the trailing slash, but here the URL actually has the trailing slash with about. So since that's the actual URL of the app, let's match that in the test. So that could be a very possible gotcha, is if the URLs do or do not have a trailing slash. And now that test is passing. And note, if I run this test again, we don't see it, but Cypress actually does wait for that page to load. So now I can go ahead and copy this, and I can just do this same thing right here, except it's not going to be about, it's going to be characters. And over here, I can do it, and it's going to be favorites. And if we go to Cypress, something interesting happens too now with our tests. When I get down to the all characters page, we actually see them render because Cypress is waiting for the page to load before it does this assertion stuff. And that's why that had to be in the arrow function. And then we see the same thing happen here with favorites, except there are no favorites. And we may just not be able to see this very last test in action here. Or maybe in my code, I actually forgot to change all characters on the favorites page, because it actually does change to favorites now that I'm looking at it. So that actually looks like a mistake that I made. And if we go to the favorites page, indeed, it still says all characters. So that was something I missed in the demo. So let's change it to favorites. And the hot module reloading works just fine with Cypress. Let's give Cypress a minute to load because it's loading all these characters. Let me go to my actual app to see if I have any favorites in here. I don't, which is what I expect. Let's just run these tests again. There we go. That's what I'm expecting to see, right? Favorites, loading. Really, we would want like a no favorites message because we're not loading anymore. But and all the characters. And I just want to pause and see if folks have any questions around this. And I think we'll have time to knock out like maybe one more test. Okay, cool. And the last test I want to make, I think that'll be good to see, is let's test the all characters page and then some cards render, because that will be an interesting and useful test. So I'll just name this 4 and we'll call it characters page structure. There were a couple other tests I wanted to show that sort of had intermediate steps for things, but this one has a lot of good stuff. So I think this is a perfect test to wrap it up. I'm going to make my describe block, and I'm going to make an it block, And we're going to check, and that autocomplete is killing me, that Bootstrap cards are rendered. And the it block will have an arrow function. And so there's a number of things I need to put inside here to make this test work. And let me go to the all characters page so we can examine it. So I'm going to need to get the card, and then I'm going to need to look at what's inside it. I want to make sure that the image is there and that some text is there. So as always, I need to navigate. Since I know I want to go right to the characters page, let's actually just visit /characters. No need to like actually click on it. We can just tell Cypress to go right there. Let's just go ahead and grab the H2 that's here for all characters and confirm that it exists, which confirms that we're in the right spot. And this next step is important. Let's tell Cypress to wait for maybe 8,000 milliseconds. Because as we've seen, it actually takes a moment for all the characters to load. And if I don't tell Cypress to wait, it'll start trying to grab stuff on the HTML page before everything has rendered. Now that we've told it to wait, let's have it look for, and let's look at what HTML we need to be grabbing. And again, you won't need to write the tests, but you all will be doing the reverse. You'll have the tests that are already written here on the left. And as you're writing code, you'll have your app here and in DevTools on the right. And when you have an error in the test, you can look at the test and see what CSS or HTML it expects and use the inspector here to see what you have and figure out the difference and then modify your code, right? So you might even want like a split so you can see the test and your code and this. Like, and in fact, if I was writing code, I would use my second monitor so I could see all three of those things at once. So let's go ahead and let's grab a card. And if I look in here, there's a div class card. So this makes life really easy. And I know that there should be a whole bunch of these. So this card array should have a length of, I'm cheating because I'm working off of my guide code, which is actually not cheating, but I think there's 826 characters in total. And we can just run this test and see if that's right. And if it's not, we'll tweak it. And here we can see each individual HTTP GET request. And it is indeed taking a long time, longer than I thought. There's this timed retrying after timeout. And in fact, the text, my code says all characters. So let's update the test. And here's what we reviewed earlier, right? Each of these is being fired by a use effect as we get each page. And because I'm using guide code, I have the right number of things here. But if I didn't have enough stuff in my list, then we would see well, if it finishes, there we go. Now we should finally be getting an error. And we would say we expected this to have a length of 826. We grabbed all the HTML elements that had this class, this class named card. We expected it to have a length of 825, and it's a little hard to read here because of that. We expected a length of 825, but we got 826, right? So now if you run into that error, you kind of know what the cause of it is. So now that we've checked that all of those things exist, let's also check that, let's grab the image element in the card, let's just grab the first card from here, the first image element in a card, and it should have an attribute, right? It's going to be the source attribute. And what I'm doing now is I want to check that indeed that image element has the actual image URL, right? That I'm loading the correct image URL in there, which is a great end-to-end test to make sure that that's working. And the way I'm going to get the correct URL is I'm just going to copy it from right here. If I can just get my browser to behave. And so you are almost definitely going to see a test like this on the assessment. And it might be written a bit more in this style, because as you can see, like once these things start to get long, this is actually quite nice. And in fact, you might see each individual argument on its own line, because I do think that this improves readability on the whole. Right, so we're testing that we're getting the image element inside all of the classes that say card. So we're grabbing all of these, we get this whole array. We only care about the first one that we're going to test. We're making sure that indeed the image element has a source attribute and that we've correctly set it to the URL for the very first character. I can only do this because I know exactly what the real data is, right? That's what allows us to write this test. And if I go over here, we can see now that indeed now this test passes. And I ran a bit long. We've eaten into the stand down time. So I think this probably is the right stopping point to pause. And I think maybe the one thing I'll show when we can wrap up is, let's say if instead of the first card, I wanted to test the last card, the butter robot. Well, the code would look almost exactly the same. And this would be 826, the very last card there. And right, this is a kind of useful test. The first thing is right, the last thing is right, probably means everything in the middle is right. And it looks like I did something wrong. And if I click on this, let's see what it says and if it can help me figure out what went wrong.
I think it should be 825.
I think, no, there's actually 826 things in the list. Oh, but it is 0 indexed. So you are totally right. There's 826 elements in our list, 826 characters, but because the array is 0 indexed, to get the very last one, it's 825. Thank you so much. And now if we give this a moment, I think we should see this test passing. There we go. Thank you for the help on that. And do folks have any questions before we wrap up and switch gears to stand down? Okay, awesome. Thank you, folks. Thanks for being patient with this running into stand down. I will have this uploading to YouTube